So back in March, we had Bernie Sanders proposed a adjustment to the standard work week, moving it to a 25% reduction from a 40-hour work week to a 32-hour work week. I This didn't really get much traction back in March, and I think there was a companion bill that was brought to the House. I'm calling this one dead in the water for all eternity. I don't think that this is ever going to go anywhere unless there's some kind of significant adjustment to the way that the U.S. labor market is architected, and that would be things like benefits and the way that you operate small businesses. Lucas, you've been looking into this a little bit. What's your take on this? And I know that back in like what the 1940s and 50s, people were predicting that this would happen, and it's long overdue for their predictions. But where are we going with the 32-hour work week?
Well, in 1930, John Maynard Keynes, an offhand remark in a speech he made, said, we're on the verge of a 15-hour work week, and sometimes people talked about a 4-hour work week. How much do we actually need to be working to produce what we need to live, and what should we be doing with the rest of our time? But the reason that I was thinking about this recently had to do with sort of the flack that Elon Musk and Vivek Ramaswamy have been taking, um, and 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 that flack coming from the their championing of the H-1B visa program and using words like meritocracy, and they've had a sufficient amount of pushback from their base. And it seemed to me like this was going to be an upcoming issue because of realities with our economy of today, especially in the United States, and some of the issues that were being tossed around in the election, immigration top of that list. So, you called it dead in the water. I don't know that it's dead in the water. I think that we've seen changes from Affordable Care Act or Obamacare to bringing to the table a conversation about immigration and about dual citizenship. I think those are all part and part like a conversation that needs to be had if we're going to be thinking about divvying up the resources or the rewards of a country, um, divvying up that pie more equally, or figuring out who deserves what, rather than running off of this concept of uh, of meritocracy or who wants to work more.
I think you got to look at it sector by sector. Because if you think about things that are definitely hands on, cleaning rooms, cutting hair, stuff like that, things where you have a certain amount of work that needs to be done. And if you materially reduced the amount of hours that people are doing those jobs, there would be less capacity to do those things. And so if you think about any business that has to have their doors open, if you were to go to a 32-hour work week, you would by necessity have to reduce the amount of operable hours that business was open. And usually when a business is open, it has a certain cost overhead. And so you have to pay rent, you got to pay electricity. A lot of the carried costs exist regardless of whether your door is open or not. So if you're reducing the amount of physical hours that the business is open, because if you were to reduce the work week by 25%, just lop it off the top, and businesses have to support that, they would either need to reduce their hours, which would substantively change the equation for their cost infrastructure, or they would have to hire more people. And neither of those things are really tenable for a lot of businesses. And I've seen things that say the small businesses in America account for something like 60 to 70% of all jobs that exist are those. And so that would not really work for those businesses. So there's a vanishing number of businesses that would really be able to absorb this. And even the ones that would, it's not necessarily tenable for them either, because when you think about what it takes to get an employee, get them trained, and actually get them productively working on something, just saying that you could hire another person and integrate them into an existing team, that's not really feasible. So you just start looking at the numbers and the math to try to accomplish this sector by sector. There are so few sectors where this would actually work. Like, think about agriculture for a minute. I mean, you got to pick peaches, right? They're already not operating off a 40-hour work week. When peaches need to be picked, they got to get picked. Like, you're not 40 hours and you're done. You're out in the fields picking those peaches until those peaches are picked. Like, you're scrambling to get that done. So I think if you look at this broadly, what are we talking about? Like office work, that job where people used to sit around the water cooler? Does that even exist? Like, I don't think it does.
Well, so yes, you're right in everything you've said, but we also need to look at what's been occurring uh, b- to continue the system as we know it today. I mean, going to the H-1B visas and immigration, there are especially the agricultural sector and home cleaning sector are handled off the books because the sectors that the government does have control over and uses bureaucracy and regulations in order to to raise the wages of the workers um, it's become unpinned from especially agriculture and I don't know what to call it, like I mean, house cleaning is the first thing that comes to mind, but anything that's done by hand.
I think that's usually referred to as the service sector. That service sector, I mean,
Yeah.
there's just like you could conceivably calculate the amount of service work that needs to be done. And that's where I said a lot of service work is tied to a location. A haircut is a great example of this, right? You go in to get a haircut. There's only a certain amount of operable hours that thing's even open. And after COVID, a lot of businesses substantively reduced their number of operable hours. Like, we used to have businesses that would be open 24/7. That almost doesn't exist anymore. You're also seeing businesses which had in times past had these broad operating hours. Now you see these remarkably constrained. Like, you've seen the operating hours of retail businesses, shops, service sector places reduced substantively. And you've seen this also in hospitality, where if you go to check into a hotel, what time do you have to check in at? Like 3, 4, 5 p.m. sometimes? I mean, if you think about, like, why does that window exist? Why do you check in so late? It's because you got to get the rooms cleaned, and there's only so many people that can clean those rooms. They only have a certain amount of capacity to do it. And so if they don't give themselves these broad windows of time to get things done, they can't get it done, because we have somehow, after COVID, ended up with a much more constrained labor market. It's really hard to hire people. If you ask most businesses, like, do you have unfilled positions? Is it hard to hire people? Overwhelmingly, they will say that it is hard to hire people and that they have a lot of unfilled positions. And so, if we were to just blanketly change the operating hours and say you can't work more than 40 hours, and it's small business that has to lump it, I mean, you would start to see these massive changes in the way that it would work. And it would also have to come with some sort of a change to the way that rent and taxation happens, because each of the localities where the service sector exists, they have this carried cost of rent and utilities and whatever. And so if nothing changes, you're going to have businesses which will be fundamentally untenable because of the taxes that are assessed, and the way that inflation continues to push on the cost infrastructure of small business.
Okay, so again, all true, but let's go back and so yes, service sector is word I was looking for. Let's think about the no tax on tips movement in Trump's campaign. You know, that's like the tipping economy is another sort of carve out that has allowed businesses or given businesses a way to find cheap labor and put the cost of paying for that labor on the shoulders of customers, sort of on expect off the book expectations of people are going to tip 20% or 25%. I don't know how long that holds, and I don't think that the government is going to find a lot of success by saying, oh, you can't work 40-hour weeks. But what they are going to find success doing is lowering the thresholds for which there are still government benefits. And I think we're going to see that all over the map because it's also it's true what you say about the overhead for business costs, but you know some of that overhead is based on benefits that businesses must provide per employee. And if some of that gets shifted over to the shoulders of the government through things like affordable health care or an expansion of Medicare or Medicaid, um, then businesses can find more part-time workers. The other thing is we've seen massaging or manipulating of the numbers for the Bureau of Labor Statistics. And I think that's also where we're going to see pressure put on the federal government or the administration to change what counts as a job. And if they're changing, what counts as employment, again, if they're giving access to healthcare and to a retirement, but people get to come in to that at 32-hour weeks or something less than 40 hours. I think there's a lot of people who will look to take that road. And you also look at other sort of demographic shifts that are going on. A generation ago, parents had four children or maybe three children, and a generation before that, they had nine children. you know Now we see a lot of people who don't have any children or only have a couple of children. Their expectations are what they're going to ride out with at the end of their life, or what sort of nest egg that they require is also changing, especially if they were one of two children from parents. And like the number of beneficiaries that are coming in from that people are inheriting. I think is also going to have a profound impact as we see more of the greatest generation passing on.
Yeah, I hear you on the tipping side of things. I think a place to get a good pulse on this is Reddit's got a subreddit specific to this. Overwhelmingly, people are already balking at this whole tipping thing. I think there was a period of time where it was viewed as, well, I have a way to give a little bit back to the people who are in these needed sectors as all of the shutdowns happened, right? If you're going to be forced to work, hey, I'm going to try and help out a little bit because you're in danger, you're in a situation where you're being exposed to the COVID virus, and that maybe isn't that fair, and people felt a lot of sympathy for it. And as the platforms for doing tipping expanded and it became a default, and I would look at Square and Stripe as kind of the players that substantively push this, because those little payment terminals had a way to turn this on. And I think there were updates that went out that just blanketly turned it on. So places where you never would have seen a tip prompt suddenly had a tip prompt. And so sectors where you could just buy something at a register, now you could get prompted to tip because you bought, I don't know, a pack of gum. And some people just did. And I don't even know what happened to those tips, because the businesses that were running them wouldn't even necessarily have a mechanism to distribute those tips. Like they weren't prepared for it, because in
You know,
restaurants and bars, tips are commonplace, but in a retail store, it maybe isn't.
well, I think there's also something deeper that's it, tipping is unfair to the worker and unfair to the customer. And if we have a structure where we have this private sector and we have businesses and we have business managers, we should expect the workers of the service industry as well as other industries to be able to be paid and not to create uh, a hole in I don't know the parity of that exchange system. So when we
It
when
used to be a tiny little sliver. I remember back in, like, the decades past, there were very few businesses where you would even contemplate leaving a tip. this became much more prevalent during COVID. I'm gonna stand on that one.
E
Like,
I mean,
and
even
this is
before
this is
then, it
beast.
like, inflation has a profound effect, and, you know, on all wages, especially if wages are chasing asset prices. If wages are chasing the price of our homes, um, you know, and those jobs or sectors that stand closest to the financial sector or to the government, have wages and salaries that are increased with according or pegged to inflation. You know, tipping, or service economy jobs are the ones that catch up last. And 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 so one, I think it's unfair to protect some labor, but not the service economy. Um, you know, and again, like you've mentioned, you know, the effect that COVID had on tipping, because you know people are also suddenly you were tipping for carry out rather than, you know, amount of time of expected service whenever you went to sit down for lunch for 40 minutes at a table, or dinner for maybe 2 hours or 3 hours or 4 hours if you're having a bottle of wine. Um, but, you know, there's a and I'm glad that you mentioned Stripe, and Square also, because you know, they used the user interface, the graphical user interface, to sort of change our expectations and to put that expectation of tipping right out there and in front, and also begin to shift that from 10% or 12% to, you know, 15, 20, or 25%. Um, so in during COVID, when I was consuming a lot of conversations, there was one that came from the chief economist for Uber that I thought was fascinating. And he had lobbied to open up tipping to Uber drivers, and against, I think what's his name, Travis, the owner of Uber at the time, or the CEO of Uber, who had been adamantly against it and said tipping is not fair. Um, and it was interesting that the economist for Uber's takeaway, whenever he looked at the numbers of what was going on once they did open up tipping for drivers, he said, you know, we can tell drivers what the expectation, or how many people are asking for rides. And before we tipped them and they had a set wage, they would respond to that number. You know, so if there was an 80% chance they were going to pick up a ride, you know, they would go out and drive at that time. But if there was a 20 or 10% chance, we'd see a huge drop in our number of drivers. He said the moment that they opened up tipping, all of a sudden, all like a large number of drivers were out driving around all the time. And he called it a tax on expectation. So I thought that was a very, you know, interesting metrics about what is actually occurring whenever we're relying on that tipping system, or at least, it exists whenever there's the alternative of a guaranteed wage or salary. So, anyway, a little bit of a tangent there.
I think the thing about tipping is, for some individuals it can be a windfall, but I think overall it's probably not the best thing in our world. And I think definitely when people come to America, they're a little shocked by it, because the more you travel internationally, the more you see that this is kind of a uniquely American thing. Like, this is not something that happens the world over. Like, a lot of countries are even surprised to see the way that you don't really know what the price is until you get to the register. And a lot of this is starting to change with new legislation that's being passed in various states. Is, you know, the hospitality sector, again, I would point to as one that had a substantive number of like little hidden fees that they really weren't displaying, and that all got realigned so that that's not available. So that there's been these weird things that have happened in specific sectors to allow for monetization in a way that didn't happen before, and there were players that gamed it and got took advantage of it and made off with, you know, a substantive amount of profits or whatever, but it was disproportionate. And so I think that this is a very uniquely American kind of discussion.
Well, I think it goes hand in hand with the ability that the United States has had for so long, since 1944, to inflate the dollars that are in circulation, being passed out by the businesses and passed around by the customers and the employees of those businesses in America, and being able to spread the inflation, the cost of inflation outside of America on other countries. And that system is coming home to roost, and we're seeing that with the price inflation that we've seen, because again, or as I often say, there's two different types of inflation. There's inflation of the money supply, and there's price inflation. And we've taken care of the price inflation and made that seem as linear for a long time. But we did so by, and again, going back to sectors, by putting it in the hands of certain sectors, especially the financial and insurance and real estate sectors. So, and that left people in the service economy very far behind, and we had to rely on alternative systems like tipping, to uh, to get people to go and work in that. That's falling apart, and again, we've seen part of this conversation bleeding over into a discussion about H-1B visas and immigration, and it's important to have that discussion because um, that's another workaround that businesses have taken advantage of to get people who, especially are from poor countries in the world, are willing to work more for less and attract them into the labor pool. But the populist movement on the MAGA side as well as the Bernie Bros sides are adamantly against that.
It's
And
yeah, it's kind of two parts to the H-1B visa. You're not wrong. It's definitely a lower wage. I think the more important thing for businesses on the H-1B visa is the retention. Like turnover is very expensive for businesses. So businesses that do the analytics on this really try to retain workers as much as possible because there's a productivity cost hump that once you get a worker over it, they become much more profitable. And so retaining that employee and the ability to express their wage is kind of the sweet spot. And the H-1B visa does that almost perfectly. And I think that that's why businesses that have taken advantage of them like it so much because you have shackled that worker to your business in such a substantive way that they wouldn't contemplate leaving. So you can give them really poor wage increases or almost no wage increases, and they're still going to stay because if they don't, they have to. I believe, and I may be out of date on the rules, but at least this is how it's worked in the past. They've had some amount of reset in whatever they're doing, or the other employer that wants to pick up that has a pretty high overhead in what it takes to absorb them switching over. So, that sponsorship of the H-1B visa is such an important aspect of it that it ends up locking that employee into that business for a long period of time, which means that they become very profitable workers if they're good.
well, you bring up another ugly side effect of inflation, and that is employee retention. How many people do you know that get hired in whatever job in corporate America today, that the moment that they get hired are already putting their resume out on LinkedIn and looking for their next job? And how many companies like both want retention in some areas, probably software development or engineering, software engineering, whatever that may be, but in other areas want to trade out employees so they don't have to continually meet the higher wage expectations of employees. And we see that. I mean, for one, we see that with teachers. When I went to school, my teachers had been teaching for 30 or 40 years, many of them. Now that doesn't hardly exist. Why? Because schools want to fire teachers. If they have to raise somebody's pay every year, they say, well, we're going to plan on keeping them for a limited amount of time, and then they're going to have to go restart elsewhere. And so, you know, I I'm when it comes to H-1B visa, I find it interesting that we abuse the lack of citizenship of people and carve out a special relationship between, non-citizens and companies to allow them to get around to get around that that
I,
reality that
I,
exists for the rest of their employees.
I'd say, having been a manager, an employer, and having sat in the side of the business, I can tell you that retention is one of the most important things. Like, the longer you can hold on to the people that are working for you, you're better off. Like, just all the way around. Like, there is a tremendous amount of effort, time, and cost that goes into getting someone to the point where they can actually productively do that job. And there are certain sectors, you mentioned teachers. I think this one varies a lot state by state. You live in a state that has strong unions, has strong labor policies, like where I live. Uh, the teachers, after they have been at a certain place, they're tenured. Like, you can't just fire them. Like, there's no way to get rid of them, and there are very defined ways that they can go out, get more education, whatever, that increase their wages. And so it's kind of within their own control to move up that system if they so desire. And leaving oftentimes means that they would abandon what they had built up within a certain position. I can also hearken to, in the world of tech, yes, there's turnover that can happen, but then there are also places where people just kind of stay put because they don't want to reset their benefits. They don't want to play the market. Like, they're not interested in bouncing around. They feel very productive in what they've done, and they also get to stay in the sandbox they're in. Some people are very loath to being on the train of having to learn brand new stuff. I mean, if you think about somebody like a plumber or an electrician, like, once you've learned tradecraft, you don't have to start all over again. But in tech, like, that's something that if you leave job that you're working at and go someplace else, like, you have to absorb a brand new code base, and that's a pretty substantive and daunting task to take on. And so once you get familiar in a code base, you kind of want to stick with it. So I don't know, there's some nuance to this idea of, like, that people can just job hopper that they want to. I think that it's probably the opposite. I think most people kind of want to stay put. They don't really want to move around too much.
I don't know. In banking and financial planning, business administration, public relations, and I think there are a lot more jobs that exist in those fields. The horizontal ladder is a real thing. And when I lived in Austin, I had many people who were working in those fields, and they would talk openly of, I landed a job at such and such financial planning company, and I'm already looking to make a jump horizontally, but also up the ladder in another company. And the companies were aware of this phenomenon too, but they participated in it um, because they didn't want to pay out pensions. Um, they don't want an employee that's been with them 30 years. There's too much expectation going forward in the future. So, um, anyway, I think they're like going back to what we started with, a shorter work week. I think there are many things that are happening in the way that we live in the world, in America especially. We see more people with multiple jobs. Um, I don't-
Yeah, I was just gonna go there. I mean, this idea that there's a 40-hour work week, that doesn't even take into account for the people who are working multiple jobs. For them, they've never experienced any kind of a 40-hour work week. They're, by their choosing and probably by necessity, working a full-time job and maybe a part-time job because that's what it takes to get by, because of what you're talking about with respect to the money supply inflation and the way that the currency is being destroyed. Like, you see people that are putting out videos right now saying, I can't even make it in this world because of the cost of living, and the amount that I'm being paid. There has started to be such a stark disparity between those two in America that there's a substantive number of people that are just falling into this, I don't even know how to make it anymore. And that 40-hour work week is not something that I think a lot of people have even had the opportunity to experience anymore because of the way that the world has realigned against them.
Well, and we've seen employers shift to contract labor, so they get away from the benefits that they have to supply for full time labor. Again, I think we're going to see more government stepping in and lowering that threshold, like acknowledging that this phenomenon already exists. Because a lot of people who have two jobs, they don't have two 40-hour jobs. They have one 10-hour job, a 12-hour job, and a 20-hour job, and that's both hard for them to balance, and but also like puts them without 401k, without maybe employer sponsored insurance. So um, our government needs to acknowledge that this is happening, and I think that people, I don't know, I think people maybe are less bored than Fritz Lang's Metropolis, and going to a factory and doing the same repetitive motion all day, but we. Um, I don't know. I'd like to see it more fair for everybody, and just and acknowledged by the government, and not just whenever they're counting the jobs that exist, as if they are all the same. Um, there's something else I wanted to touch on, but let me think for a second. Anything else you wanted to add?
I just think about this on such a sector by sector basis. I mean, when Bernie Sanders says something like this, I just gotta first, what portions of the workforce are we really talking about that could possibly operate this way? It seems like the one sector that possibly he could influence or that this could work for would be government employees. Because if you think about what government employees are doing, their work is disconnected from any real world function, right? Like think about something like the people who run the Department of Motor Vehicles or licensing department or inspections or stuff like that, right? It's not directly tied to the productive capacity of the planet. It's not like getting a haircut. It's not like fixing a toilet. It is not like picking fruit. It has to do with government momentum for the sake of government momentum. And in a lot of cases, it's sort of doing things that aren't adding obviously to the economy. Like they definitely put money into the economy and it's government creating money and putting money into the economy in that sense, but it's not directly tied to stuff that you could think about as the productive capacity of the planet. I mean, in some ways, maybe inspections, oversight, and regulation, not letting the planet become destroyed through pollution or something like that, maybe, but like it's pretty hard to, contemplate where some bill like this could actually get through and have an impact other than excluding almost all of the small businesses and focusing almost entirely on government. Like that to
So
me is the only place where this really could work, or maybe really big companies where the government is trying to get some kind of a leverage position over that really big company.
I mean, this is one of the most powerful tools that the president has for exactly the reason that you just described. One, I posted up a leak of Richard Cantillon, who's a French economist or a French philosopher who talked about this effect, and how those who stand next to government or stand next to the king are the first to pass around money, and how it flows like water from government. Um, which is called the Cantillon effect. But the when the president wants to change the minimum wage that exists in the United States, he can do two things. He can write proposed legislation and submit that to Congress, or he can turn around and say, "Oh, I have employees that work all over the country in post offices, and FBI offices, and in federal courthouses, and I can issue a and now I can't remember what they're called. President, the president. I'll think of it later. Anyway, I can issue a rule for the federal government that as a corporation that we're going to pay these people more, and like in a state like New Mexico that has severely depressed wages, like all of a sudden towns lose their well, first the state raises the pay of state troopers and state employees to match that with the federal government bureaucrats, or they're going to lose everybody running over to the post office and to like the clerical federal jobs that there are, and then you lose law enforcement and other agencies. You'll lose people who were deputies for the sheriff's department going to work for the National Forest Service. Why? Because the federal government's paying more. So that is one of the most powerful things that the president can do, and especially when it comes to pay rates that exist around the nation. But another thing that I think of in the world that we come to today, as we learn about Facebook and DM, and we
Well,
think
wait,
about.
wait. But before we go to those, I want to speak just briefly to like what we know about certain other parts of how the labor markets work. Developed nations, I think, work much differently, and in Europe, I think it works even substantively more different than the United States on the spectrum of where companies are controlled by the policies that the specific governments in the European Union hand down, because there's a lot of protection around people's jobs and it's not easy to fire people and there's much less moving around. It also means that wages are substantively suppressed, but it also means that your wages go towards things that in America you don't have to think about. Like you have managed healthcare, you have managed pensions, you have free schooling. There's a lot of things that you just don't have to pay for, whereas in America you do, and your wages are supposed to go towards paying for a lot of that kind of stuff. And so if you think about like what do you want to really use your money on, it's usually to enjoy life and to do things. And I would argue that a lot of Europeans have more productive use of their life than what you experience in America. In America, like what we get like a week or two off, and that's our vacation. In Europe, you get this big chunks of time off for family, for childcare, for caring for sick people, for sick relatives, whatever. I mean, like the amount of time that you can get off in the EU is so much more than in America, as well as you have so many things that you just fundamentally do not have to pay for, that the money that you've got can go towards things that look more like the enjoyment of your life. Whereas in America, so much of what your wages go for is not the enjoyment of your life, but rather the existence of your life. And I think that that's an important point to make when we're thinking about these things. Is that when we think very American focused, we don't even think about how other parts of the planet work and how a place like the EU can push things in this direction because they already have so much control over how businesses and employers and pensions and managed healthcare all work intertwined to have a lifestyle. It's much different. So I think it's hard to have these conversations without rooting it within a specific sector or within the United States itself, because it's hard to talk about it broadly. Because I just don't know what Bernie Sanders is even talking about. Like, who experiences this 40-hour work week? Not part-time workers, not contract workers, not service sector workers, not people who are working in agriculture. And if you start to add all those things up, there really isn't that many people that this could even apply to, because there aren't that many people who even experience that kind of thing. And so it's almost like Bernie thinking about this is out of touch with the reality of the modern workforce. And I don't know if that's because he's just not thinking about it correctly, or because he's part of a generation where this actually existed and it just hasn't existed in probably at least 20 years.
Well, fair. But we also, what's part of the difference between the American system and the European system? Um, you know, European nations had their own monies. They acted like communes. They were able to rely on property taxes and sales taxes, agriculture, commodity taxes in those countries. In the United States, we got off of that system with the magical income tax, and that was an incredible boon towards the federal government, because all of a sudden you could pay for the government by also forcing people to work, or raising their wages, and thus taking more money back. So it's very interesting again to look at Trump, and with regards what he said about absolutely repealing the income tax. If he does so, that will put a lot of power back into the states. And as we also come to a new place, and understanding multiple monies, as we so often talk about cryptocurrencies here, we can begin to understand and see the power, or the difference of a state money that can be funded off of property taxes as opposed to income taxes. And then if we
Well,
also.
that one's difficult and dangerous because the property taxes part is so tied to inflation, because usually what's going on is there's this treadmill of increasing valuations, increasing amounts of levies going towards that pot. I mean, I've seen this in certain parts of the country where you've been on this roller coaster for quite some time, and it's getting to the point where it's almost unsustainable, but it is hidden from most people because they're rolled into, like a mortgage, and the mortgage is tied to the bank, and the bank just does all of that stuff. And so these things are very easy to hide away, and what it means is that you're just paying for that house for a longer period of time. So it's like there's this pot of money that was being stolen from, and it was being stolen from in a very insidious way. But that runway has run out. Like now you're going to directly see it. Like you can't just increase the length anymore. You can't just have this get hidden away. It starts to directly be felt by the people who are paying mortgages, because it comes out in a higher monthly amount, and there's no ability to refi it and sort of realign it and keep your costs aligned. So now every time they go out and increase those property taxes and they go after those levies, it's starting to come out of the pocket of individual homeowners and taxpayers directly. And there really isn't an ability to tap those people anymore. And so what you're going to start finding is that people no longer can afford to live in certain areas, and they get emptied out of places where they used to be able to exist, and that they it that I don't know how that's going to work. It'll be surprising if it does work. I see this property tax thing as that could get really bad, really ugly. So if the
Well,
thought is that that's how it's going to shift, that might get super bad.
well, I think the problem that we see in the incredible amount that we have to pay for property tax has to do with the inflation of the asset value, and that being out of the control of the people in an area. But why is that out of control? It's because money is being made elsewhere. It's being trotted in again through especially government jobs, raising the wages in that area, and instead of, we talk about the increased taxes, and we're talking about the amount, but not the rate. Government figured out a long time ago that, oh, we can create an income tax, and that is bound by, like number of transactions, or we can create transactional taxes like sales tax, and then those places who are relying on property tax have to run to keep up. And but again, when we have not just, again, cryptocurrencies, when we have different monies, or like have an understanding of the differences in these things that underpin what the accounting system is, what we're transacting in, we're going to be able to put more, or realize more emphasis and stability in things like property taxes. And I think we're first going to see that through through, again, I mentioned Facebook and DM, but think about Ford. Ford, Henry Ford paid his workers enough in a year so they could buy a car, so he could have customers to buy his cars. Um, uh, uh, John D. Rockefeller, had oil towns and steel towns across America. and the town paid the workers and also supplied the food and the housing for everyone in that town. And they had their own economic systems. Dodge Phelps, same thing in coal towns. Um, they had their own economic system, and part of what was unfair was there were no alternatives that kept them in check from abusing the power over their currencies. But now we have more sophisticated communication, we have more sophisticated technology, and I think that we can see the choice of having multiple currencies beginning to benefit people of America and around the world.
Hopefully those currencies start to reduce this amount of distortion. I think this whole what's happened with the US dollar has allowed for this kind of distortion to occur. And so to the extent that these alternative currencies allow for the real productivity of the planet to be reflective in what people are paid, and maybe if we start to say in declining population, which I don't even think we really got to, I kind of threw it on the screen for a second, but in the face of declining fertility, and we just don't have this continuing bubble of population to sort of say, well, this all sort of gets normalized and figured out because we just keep needing more and more. When we start to contract the number of people on the planet, you really have to get this stuff right, because you can't just pass it off to the next generation and have it happen through growth. Like you have to start to normalize the activities, and you have to normalize the profits that are being collected, and make sustainable systems. And so the generations that exist right now, the people that are in their teens and their 20s are going to see a radically different planet than people who are in their 60s and 70s. Like this planet's going to look much different in the next 20 years than it did in the last. And maybe that's too big of a thing to sort of open up at the end of this discussion, but it's something I think about when I think about your comment. But I think we're kind of coming to the top here.
Yeah, and good points about the demographic, population decline. I think that's whenever we also begin to see more. We're going to see people begin to talk more about inheritance and estate tax, and maybe more so estate tax. But it is another discussion. I will just say that estate tax was written into the Articles of Confederation. But we don't want to. That'll be 15, 20 more minutes. We'll save it another day.
Yeah, good conversation though. I really appreciate it. See you next time on Fomo.
All right. Till then.